Me and Qian Ping will be doing a presentation on the Iroquois, which were the native people of North America, mostly what is known as the USA today, and they resided mostly around present-day New York. So first of all, there's a matter of who colonized the Iroquois. So the Iroquois were colonized by several countries because they were the native people of North America. But the main groups that colonized them were the English. So the English's plans were to initially just come in and start taking as much gold as they could, but then this didn't really work, and then they had to start settling down a bit, and then this led to a lot of tension between the local groups and the English. But then they mostly just settled down and they started trading with the locals. And then the French, they pretty much they didn't really have much relations with the locals. They would just trade, but then they also exploited in the sense that they would come and they would farm their own crops and they would take some of the natural resources and use them for themselves and also send them back to the countries. And then the Dutch, they really didn't care much about the natives. They were just there to trade. So the only time they would really interact would be to trade pelts with the native, which were beaver, which is what was mostly traded. So one of the first groups to colonize the North American region were the Dutch. So how this started is that in 1609, after the Americans and French had already set foot in North America, there was an explorer by the name of Henry Hudson who was looking for the northwest sea route to Asia, but he didn't find it after sailing west, and instead he found three waterways which were subsequently named after him. It was the Hudson River, Bay, and Strait. And in the picture on the bottom right, you can see the Hudson River labeled. And then if you look in at the top, you can see where in the big map the Hudson River is located, which is northeast America. So the Dutch then claimed the land around this area and established a trading post along the Hudson River whereby they would trade with the Iroquois for beaver pelts. So this colony was given to the Dutch West India Company by the Dutch government in 1621. So it was privately owned, and then, however, this colony did not attract many people to come live in it, as people didn't really want to go live in colonies. So then they had to allow other nations to come in. So explorers from Germany and Scotland and a lot of other places were coming in, and they were living in this colony, and they were also trading and using the space and bringing in their ideas. So the Dutch really had little intention to inhabit the land, so they decided to just trade with the locals, which was predominantly fur from beavers, which the locals hunted, and then they would exchange them for items like food. But then, in exchange for fur, they would trade them their more advanced tools, which included the big one was guns, which then the Iroquois would use to more effectively hunt and then increase their trade. However, they would also trade them things like knives and other metal tools and cloths and things that were basically beyond the Iroquois technology at the time. So, with a large demand for fur, the Iroquois started using weapons. The weapons they traded to hunt more beavers, and by 1640, almost all of the beavers in the area had disappeared, which led them to seek for a colder region where they could find more beavers to keep up with the trade, and this is why they reached the St. Lawrence River. However, this place was already occupied by the rival indigenous clan who were known as the Huron, and the Huron were associated with the French since they would trade with them. And then this is when the Iroquois came in and they eliminated the Huron and pushed them out of this area. There was a bit of tension with the French as they were partners. However, later on in 1664, when the English were trying to expand their territory in the seek for more land, King Charles II authorized his brother, who was the Duke of York, to drive out the Dutch. So this was after they had already had three wars with the Dutch for territory. However, when they showed up in New Netherlands, the Dutch easily surrendered the territory without any conflict. So they didn't shoot a single bullet, and they just gave over the territory and went back home. What were the motivations of the Dutch at the time that they came to colonize? In terms of Christianizing, they didn't really care much about cultural assimilation with the natives, and then they somewhat, in a sense, you could have said they civilized the natives since they introduced them to more advanced tools and techniques for hunting and stuff like that. But however, the Dutch were mostly there to commercialize. So, as I said, the Dutch didn't force any sort of cultural assimilation with the natives, and they didn't really take much interest in their traditions or belief, and they didn't really place themselves in a position of superiority against the Indians. They just saw themselves as equals. So the Indians at the time, they saw this as the Dutch not being hospitable, as the Dutch also would charge them to fix guns, and the Dutch would also rarely give the Indians with anything. They would always charge for everything. So mostly the Dutch saw the Indians as trade partners, and for this reason, they allowed them to live as they wanted. And since they viewed them as trading partners, they were a source of wealth, so they didn't really want to do anything to agitate them or like go against them or attack them. Furthermore, they also tried to be as fair as possible by applying Dutch law to the Iroquois people. An example of this was in 1647 when barber surgeon Harman van der Bogart had an affair with a man. At the time, this was very wrong, and when he was discovered, he fled into an Iroquois longhouse, which he had already befriended the people there a while ago. So then, when he was tracked down, there was a shootout inside the longhouse, and he decided to burn the house as a cover to get away. However, when he was captured, he was then captured. But then, when the Indians realized that the Dutch law could also benefit them, they applied this, and the owners of the longhouse went to the New Netherland Company and the India Dutch Company, and they sued them, and they were compensated with the money that the company made from selling Bogart's properties in order to rebuild what they had lost. Um, so in these terms you could see the colonizers and the locals had respect for each other since they saw each other as equals. However, the indigenous did see the Dutch as unhospitable since they would try and charge them for everything because that was their main purpose of being there, which was commercializing. So, in terms of civilizing, the Dutch didn't directly go to the natives and civilize them by socializing and purposely interacting, as they took little interest in their way of life. However, they did indirectly civilize them, since they introduced a variety of new tools which allowed them to more easily carry out specific tasks, of which an example is the hunting beaver, which before they would have to do with bows and arrows, which would be a lot more time consuming than with guns. So commercializing was obviously the main goal of the Dutch, and since they didn't originally intend to colonize the heart of North America when the Hudson set out westbound, this mostly promoted business, and it was probably since they didn't have the provisions necessary to set a proper settler colony, since they didn't plan for settling. So the product they most sold was beaver, and in fact, in 1648, it was estimated that some 80,000 beaver pelts were heading to Europe from North America, and in exchange for the pelts, they would offer them the Iroquois guns and ammunition as well as repairs. Alcohol was also a big trade item, however, they weren't allowed to sell it to the Indians, but many disregarded the consequences and still sold them to them. In addition, as tobacco started becoming more prevalent as a commercial product, the Dutch started to grow it in New Netherlands and send it back to the Netherlands, which at the time became one of the tobacco capitals of the world. So, the type of colony which the Dutch used was an exploitation colony, and this was obvious since they sold guns, they sold tobacco. Well, they didn't sell tobacco, they grew it, but you can see how they were using the natives' land, and they also sold alcohol. So it is obvious that it was an exploitation colony since they had little regard for the locals or their way of life or trying to even interact with them. The next group, which was introduced to North America, were the French. So the way that this happened was that in 1534, there was a Frenchman by the name of Cartier who reached the Gulf within the eastern coast of Canada, and he decided to keep sailing inward until he came upon a very large island with a big mountain on it, and this island was named Mount Royal, which later became known as Montreal. This mountain led to a large river which was dubbed the St. Lawrence. 10 years later, Samuel took du Champlain, which was a French colonist as well, took 32 fellow colonists with him to sail up to the St. Lawrence, where they found what is now known as Quebec. And in 1673, a priest by the name of Marquette and a trader set off to the upper Mississippi River, and then 10 years later, another French explorer explored the Mississippi, and they decided that the entire valley would belong to the French, and this became known as Louisiana, named after the reigning King Louis. So the large colony quickly became a trading empire, but with little to nobody wanting to actually settle down and build houses and have kids, they had very little interest in occupying land, as they were predominantly there for trading. However, there were some Catholic priests to seek to educate the indigenous people about Christianity and convert them, which was one of the motivations of some of the French. However, when the English wanted to expand and seize more control of land, they stumbled upon some of the French's North American territory, and this caused numerous amounts of wars and conflicts between the two, until an agreement over the possession of the Ohio Valley, sorry, not agreement, commenced a war between the British and French, which became known as the French Indian War, since the Indians, who were the Iroquois, partnered with the French in this war. This later escalated to the Seven Years' War, and ultimately the British army aided Britain in winning the battle and removing the French, which led them to acquire a large amount of territory in the eastern side of North America, pushing the English territory further out and setting back the amount of property which the French owned. What were the motivations of the French in terms of Christianizing, civilizing, and commercializing? There were numerous French priests who followed along and tried to educate locals about Christianity. However, cultural assimilation was not strongly pushed forward, since a lot of French colonizers didn't really want to settle down in this new territory, and they were just there mainly for commercializing. Adding on to this, the French took very little interest in staying, so they didn't really civilize the population either. And their largest reason for being in North America was trade, and specifically this was for beaver pelts, which at the time were in large demand throughout Europe. And they partnered with the Huron, who were a local ethnic group that would also, like the Iroquois, harvest pelts. However, the Huron were competition for the Iroquois. So one big thing here was the French were competition for the Iroquois. So the Iroquois didn't really see these French colonizers very positively, and the French either, as the Iroquois were the ones who eliminated their trading partner. So you can see that between these two groups there was a lot of tension. So the Iroquois didn't really view the French very positively, as the French had partnered with their rival clans. However, the French did still trade for pelts, which saw a trading relationship, and the French didn't really look at the Iroquois very positively, as they would still have conflicts over land, and you can see that this relationship was tense. So what type of colony were the French? So the French, as you can see, were an exploit colony, since they would mostly just trade fur. And as you can see in the image, you can see how there was the beavers, and then you have the Native Americans coming to hunt them, and then preparing the pelts, and then they're taking them to the European colonizer, which you can see in the third image, and then he's trading them a gun, and then the Europeans taking it back to the colony, and then it's being shipped back to France where it's being used. So the final group which entered the North American territory at the time were the English. So according to Crash Course U.S. History on YouTube, in 1606 the British decided to set out to America. So they were funded by the colony was funded by a company of private London investors under the command of King James, and they set out in 1607 and reached the coast of Virginia and named it as theirs. Initially, the colony didn't get off to a very good start, which is because the settlers were really looking for lots of gold and products which they could take back to the mainland and sell. And they forgot to plant crops, and a lot of them ended up dying of starvation since they didn't have enough food to go around. This also worked simultaneously with the locals, who at the time saw the English as a threat, to wipe out 7 out of 10 English settlers within the first 10 years. However, later they gained some traction when they started growing tobacco and selling it as a profitable product in England. Here you can clearly see that their initial intentions were not to settle, but to commercialize, which didn't work very well, which shifted the outlook of the colony into a more hybrid colony. Another group of English which entered the North American territory were the Pilgrims, who were a religious group from England who were trying to escape the Anglican Church's control and persecution in England for their religious beliefs. Therefore, in the pursuit of religious freedom, they started a colony in Massachusetts in 1620, and later on in 1630, the Puritans, who were similar to the Pilgrims, also sought religious freedom from the Anglican Church in England, which led them to establish an even larger English colony in the Massachusetts Bay. It'd be logical that these two colonies would seek to spread their opinion on religion in a new country in order to gain support against the Anglican Church, who had several biblical concepts that that the Puritans did not believe were true in authentic Christianity. This shed lights on one of their motives, which was to Christianize. However, it was done so in a very specific way, as the Puritans wanted to set a model community as to how religion should be handled. These communities were similar to their counterpart English colony, which was known as Jamestown, named after King James, since they didn't know very well at first what to do, and a lot of them also died. However, since there were a large amount of families which they brought them, this allowed them to take hold and later on start thriving as colonies. So as mentioned before, in the seek of land and power, the English fought several wars against the Dutch, trying to gain more control. However, it was not until previously mentioned that in 1644 the Dutch surrendered without struggle that the English renamed New Netherland as New York. The acquisition of this land bridged their north and south colonies, allowing them to become even more powerful. By 1750, there was 1.2 million English settlers which resided in either of the 13 English colonies. While further seeking more expansion, the English also expanded further west until they bumped into the French, who for them were competition for both resources and land, and thus they needed to eliminate them. This was the start of a series of conflicts and wars between the two, as tensions heightened over who owned what. Furthermore, the Indians saw some of the colonizers, such as the French and Dutch, as partners, and they would partner with them to attack other colonies. So, what were the motivations of the English? A few English sought to Christianize, which, as explained, were the Pilgrims and Puritans. So, as here, the Pilgrims and Puritans saw the natives as uneducated, and they tried to go in and spread their religion as they thought it was right. A big goal was also to commercialize, as they were a hybrid colony. So, this was done for gold, sale, weapon trade, and the large fur trade. So on the images in the left, you can see in the small bubble the weapons which the Iroquois first used, which are axes and bows and arrows, and basic weapons. And then you can see when the English came in, they now had guns and more metal tools, which allowed them to more easily hunt. Furthermore, in terms of civilization, the English did enslave some of the locals and bring them into their own colonies and force them to work. So, the English, as I mentioned before, became a hybrid colony, although at first they did try to be an exploit colony, which failed, and to keep them alive as solely an exploit colony, so then they had to shift into a hybrid colony. So this was because the explorers wanted to get rich very quick, and they only wanted to look for gold, which is not really as prominent in North America as in other countries. So, with the lack of gold and the necessity for food, they were forced to trade with the locals and begin settled agriculture. The views here, the locals saw the English as competition. However, they did trade with them initially, as they saw them as a chance to gain more weapons, as they had already been trading with the French and Dutch as well. So this prompted the shift from an exploit colony into a hybrid colony as the English started to settle down. However, since the locals did see competition here, there was a lot of conflicts which later arise between the English and the Iroquois. So, what happened when the colonizers first arrived? The English settlers thought that the indigenous could be replaced as they thought they weren't using the land properly. So, here you can see that the English wanted to farm and make products that they could sell, and they didn't believe that the Iroquois were using it properly. Furthermore, you can see that the English thought that the Iroquois wanted help and they wanted them to come in and trade, as you can see in the stamp of the Massachusetts colony, which says, "Come over and help us." Furthermore, the introduction of colonizers also brought in several diseases which the locals didn't like, and this is what led them to have a bad image of the colonizers because the diseases eliminated large amounts of the population of the locals. And the colonizers also caused intertribal warfare. So this was because the colonizers really wanted fur at the time. So then the different local groups, such as the Iroquois and the Huron, which I've mentioned before, um, started competing for the best hunting ground to see who could get the most fur, and this caused a lot of conflict between the tribes. Furthermore, they also introduced new weapons and tools, which was what led to the massive beaver trade and the overhunting of the beavers, and this is what prompted some of the tribal warfares that I've mentioned. The Iroquois had a very lengthy constitution which basically set out the guidelines for the interaction between the several clans within the Confederacy and how they would handle their affairs. They would have a Grand Council which would approve decisions for the group and clan. So their constitution said that they all shared the land, the different tribes were separated by only tongue which they spoke. They would fight laws with other clans outside of the Confederacy. However, these would be mostly grieving wars where they would go out and attack other clans, but only to take in members from them and convert them to their own. This is because the Iroquois strongly believed that the dead should be replaced by other people as they held high significance. Those who refused assimilation would be tortured gruesomely until they died. In terms of power, the clan mothers would hold significant amount of power. However, their decisions would still need to be approved by the council. When the different clans met, they would send in representatives from themselves, and they would choose a longhouse to meet in and discuss affairs. Social structures, they had what were called moieties. So this was basically groups within themselves that would distinguish themselves either socially or ritually. These were made up of about 2 or 3 clans, and they would refer to each other as brothers inside these moieties. However, people outside would be referred to as cousin. This is how they religiously distinguish themselves. They were also very matrilineal, which means that the woman had a very high influence in society. This becomes evident when one looks at the clan mothers. They would normally be the ones looking after the tribe and making sure that everything runs smoothly. Furthermore, they would also appoint new chiefs, which would and make a recommendation for them, and then the chief would have to be agreed on by the brother tribes and the members of the Grand Council. They would also be the ones that named the children and ensured that nobody married a person in the same clan. In terms of gender roles, the male and female are very balanced, and the female were also respected members of society, as were men. The female would tend to stay in the village and grow crops and tend to needs in the longhouse and become the clan mothers when they were the oldest inside the clan. Men would go out and hunt and fight, and they would become the chiefs. However, when the colonizers came and then they introduced a large beaver trade, the men would tend to go out for longer times hunting, which would offset the gender roles, as women would have to do more tasks, which the men would have to do, since they would be out beaver hunting. In some aspects, you could say that the wealth of society was increased, but it was also both decreased by the colonization. So how was it increased? Well, the English brought in large amounts of trade and allowed the Indians to trade their surplus products, which were mostly beaver, for more useful things and advanced tools such as cloth and others. In this sense, they did increase the wealth of society as they introduced a lucrative trade, since before the natives had few people to trade with, and then they were introduced to an international trade, which allowed them to gain a lot of tools and wealth. However, in another aspect, the colonizers did reduce the wealth of society since they forcefully overtook the land, which otherwise would have been in the ownership of the natives. Furthermore, the natives at one point, the colonizers did capitalize on the resources of the natives. An example was gold, which they came in and started looking for it and trading as they wanted. However, this later became an unsuccessful trade. In this aspect, you can see that the colonizers would take the natives' resources, which otherwise would have been theirs to do whatever they wanted to, and they would have, in this sense, stolen wealth. So, in terms of infrastructure, the colonizers did build some structures and they did build a lot of towns and they did set up a lot of trading posts. However, they did also attack lots of the Iroquois' longhouses and villages and cause lots of destruction. Furthermore, you could say it was mutually beneficial since they both traded and both gained a lot out of it. However, it was more beneficial for the colonizers as they had the power of decision since they had a larger population, they had more advanced tools, and they basically had control over the natives if an attack came.